welcome back to another KiteCast episode. I'm your host for today's call, Patrick Spencer. I am thrilled to be joined by two cybersecurity and compliance leaders, Heather Noggle, who I'll let her introduce herself here in a moment, but just as a high-level introduction, she's a regular speaker on various circuits, on podcasts and webinars. She's an advisory board member for the Missouri Cyber Center of Excellence. She's the founder and principal at CoStat. And then Arun DeSouza, if you've been watching any of our KiteCast episodes, you'll know he's appeared in a couple. We did one deep dive with him on his background, which is fascinating, the journey that he's had in cybersecurity. And then he joined me for, I think it was the CMMC. I'm trying to remember which, one of our recent podcasts where we looked at one of our industry thought leadership reports, survey reports, and he provided some great insights. And he has joined us again for our annual survey report, where we look at data security and compliance issues. It's a very, very meaty report. We'll have that as a link at the bottom of today's podcast. It's 50 plus pages. It has a bunch of charts and graphs. We surveyed 461. Don't ask me why it's 461 versus 460. Industry professionals in cybersecurity, compliance, risk management, as well as IT around the globe. So there's some valuable insights that our audience will find useful, and we're going to look at least at some of them during today's podcast. And I'm going to be quiet and let Heather and Arun pontificate on those. But before we dive into some of the questions I have for them, I thought we'd do a little deeper dive in terms of an introduction for each of them. Heather, tell our audience, where you're based and what you do and how your career has evolved.
Sure. I am Heather Noggle. I'm in the lower part of Missouri, the southwest corner called Springfield, Missouri area. And I work with the Missouri Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. It is a nonprofit that is teaching the next generation of practitioners and getting them some work experience in addition to their self-study and their degrees and whatever walks of life that our interns are working in. We bolster that so they can get jobs. And we also are working to make the Missouri region, all of Region D where we're located, better at cybersecurity, local and county governments, local cities, etc. And then I also do some consulting work through my firm CoStat. I have a long career in export compliance software, so I come at everything in compliance from just a slightly adjacent angle. And also a lot of security people tend to come from the network background and the systems engineering, and I'm more software. So that's who I am.
That's great. That's interesting background. Everyone I interview has a different background, obviously. Arun, remind your audience about your evolution in the cybersecurity and compliance space.
Yeah, thank you for the warm welcome, Patrick. It's good to spend time with you, and I particularly appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and Heather today. A few words. I've over 20 years experience as a CISO, and I've built 2 security programs from the ground up. Now, the second program was unique insofar that I built an integrated security and privacy program from the outset, anticipating at the time the regulatory winds of change, right? And then as the Chief Information Security and Privacy Officer, I led the corporate mobilization for GDPR and HIPAA. So I made data characterization, protection, and governance a priority, powered by a policy-centric framework in collaboration with key business functions such as HR, legal, internal control, and internal audit, and overarching Information Security and Privacy Council. My team, along with IT and other stakeholders, work to deploy people, process, and technology safeguards to ensure data privacy and minimize enterprise risk while enabling the business. And fast forward to today, now I'm an executive advisor with Netscope, and I continue to stay abreast of the whole data protection space and privacy, but as well related macro trends such as data sovereignty, observability, zero trust, SASE, and AI, among others.
AI, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. That's one of the questions we had in the report, needless to say. I think everyone has to ask that question. So we, this year, for the first time, and we've done this in a couple adjacent studies and reports that we've published, developed a risk score algorithm that basically accounts for 3 different factors that we ask our survey participants about. One, how many breaches related to data did you have in the past year? One. Two, what did the litigation cost? Litigation being just one factor of the total cost that one experiences from the data breaches, we know as well as our audience. And then three, the time to actually remediate. We created this algorithm, which you'll find in the report, and then it scores it. We rationalized it on a scale of 0 to 10. And it came out that we were about at a 5 in terms of average. So that I interpret as a good algorithm, so we don't have something that's too far weighted one direction or the other. But we also looked at them from the perspective of critical risk, high risk, and so forth. We had 15% when we looked at the total number of responses that fell into that 15% high critical risk area. And quite frankly, if we added in the next component, which was high risk, we had, I think, almost half of the participants fall into that area. Arun, let's start with you. You've had a look at those findings at a high level anyway. What's your reaction to seeing risk quantified in this way, the way we went about this algorithm?
Thank you,
What's
Patrick.
it mean for the median organization sets at 4.almost 5, 4.84?
Yeah, the few questions that you assigned me to, sort of give and prepare some thoughts for, this was kind of the hardest one, honestly. So I might, wax eloquent for a minute. So pardon me. So first of all, based on your three factors, it's very insightful to understand the state of cyber risk in the industry, at least limited to the survey response sample size that you have, right? However, in the immortal words of Aaron Levinstein, what statistics reveals is suggestive, but what they conceal is vital, right? So, in my view, these results indicate three macro observations regarding the state of enterprise risk as highlighted and illustrated in the report. Number one, ecosystem risk, right? So, a critical state in cybersecurity for so many enterprises indicates a broader systematic risk. As such, then, vulnerabilities in any one organization can have cascade effects across interconnected systems and supply chains to amplify ecosystem risk. Number two is cyber resilience, right? It's absolutely mission critical and vital for enterprises to prioritize cybersecurity investments, implement robust security measures in the form of appropriate people, process, and technology safeguards, and of course, enhance their ability to prevent, detect, and respond to cyber attacks. And thirdly, strategic alignment. I couldn't help myself. So essentially, so many enterprises in or near a critical state, it really implies a lack of adequate investment in cybersecurity, in my view, especially in the current dangerous milieu of dynamically evolving and sophisticated cyber threats. Enterprises are frequently attacked, right? So, in the absence of strategic mobilization, as noted, enterprises will find it hard to detect attacks by myriad threat actors in a timely fashion and may consequently incur major financial and reputational losses. Now, the one caveat that I would have is I think your results, Patrick, are being masked due to the present factors that are selected, right? I believe maybe a future iteration could expand these key dimensions, adding, for example, people factors such as insider threat, training and awareness, negligence, and cyber skills gap, technology factors like identity compromise, vulnerabilities, and misconfigurations, and as well process factors, example, digital transformation or ecosystem compromise, emerging technology integration, legacy governance, and so on and so forth. Thoughts?
Yeah. It always depends on the type of data, I think, that's involved as well in the breach, right? Some data is more sensitive than others, and that's a question we could add for next year's report, and that gets baked into our algorithm, and we have 4 or 5, or, well, if we go with your list, maybe 50 elements as part
No,
of
well,
the
it's just my thoughts, right? No.
Heather, do you
I
have
was
any
only
thoughts on
saying
that? And then, good, go ahead, Arun, sorry.
My thoughts always tend
no,
toward the people in the process because as the organization shifts and grows with whatever is changing out in the environment, what probably isn't changing is the way we look at it and the way we view it and whether we're seeing the risk. And so the more strategic we are about, okay, this is changing, how does this affect what we care about and what we protect? And to do that as early as possible, I think any reports that come out that get us thinking are super helpful. And this is no exception.
That's a good point. Now, Heather, here's a question for you. We looked at the data from the standpoint of third parties and how many third parties organizations actually exchange sensitive data or private data with. And we discovered that organizations that exchange data with between 1,000 and 5,000 third parties actually had a higher risk score than those that exchange data with 5,000 plus. Why do you think that's the case?
I think if you're looking at more than 5,000 third-party vendors, you are probably ahead of the game and really working to manage that because it is such a risk. We really haven't focused until this year on third-party as the big risk factor. And I think we're starting to do that with what you're finding and what we've seen in the Verizon DBIR, that third-party risk is the new hotness. And therefore, we now need to get ahead of that with the medium businesses. In years past, medium-sized businesses have been ahead of the game because they've been adopting things on a more frequent scale than maybe the more monolithic big organizations, but I think the big organizations are having their heyday and doing a better job of taking care of what it is that they're protecting and maybe understanding that. And with third-party risk, it's not a new thing. We can go all the way back to the Target breach. It is now, though, going to be something we have to absolutely focus on, which means we need to treat third parties as assets. We need to know exactly who they are, what they're providing us, and all of the data about them so that we can secure where they touch what's important to us. An alternative way to do that is to really look at what's important to us and then be very careful about what we select as third-party vendors. So it depends on where we are in the life cycle of how mature we are in our relationships and what we can change.
Yeah. There's a lot of best practices one needs to follow when dealing with third parties, and it's more than a checklist that needs to be adhered to. Is that an accurate assessment?
Very accurate. And, we're talking SBOMs now, and knowing in software integration, we've been doing that a long time. Who are we integrating with? What data are we sending? How are we securing that? How frequently are we double checking to make sure that's secure? And the technologies behind that have evolved over time and how we manage that. I've actually shuttled flat files back and forth. I've been in the industry that long. And so, how do we secure that? I can talk about AS2, I can talk about modern methods, but those things change, but what we're protecting doesn't change so much. So we need to have a very systematic approach to how are we protecting, what are we protecting, and how do we inspect that so we get into the governance piece of it. And so now we're governing our third parties, and we need to do that very intentionally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if I may, fantastic insights, Heather. I think
Go ahead, Arun. Sorry.
Yeah, no, not to worry. I was just saying, fantastic insights, Heather. The thing that strikes me is, when you're managing, like you mentioned, over 5,000, by nature, it means that you're a much bigger organization. So you're a lot more resources and, people and stuff. And many a time you've got a platform-based approach. I mean, obviously it's people, process, technology, but if you've got a platform, I think prevalent or whatever it is, that you can have, I think it's much more easier to manage these and issue the control things. And I think that might be something that was not asked, but might be one of the reasons why these organizations are doing better, because they can see in real time some of the risks, whether there was a phishing attack compromising one of the vendors or whatever, right? So I think that it makes a lot of sense to me, and I fully agree with what Heather said.
I could. That's a good idea. We'll add that in supplemental report. We actually could analyze the data from the standpoint of the number of privacy enhancing technologies, for example, and practices that they have in place versus their risk scores. That's a great point. That would be an interesting exercise. Arun, there was a counterintuitive finding, or I thought it was perhaps, in the report, where organizations that are somewhat confident in their data control have higher risk scores than those who say they're not confident at all. You would think those that are not confident at all would be, at severe risk, but that's not the case. Why do you think that's the case? There's always, an overconfidence level when you talk about, someone's baby. You never call someone's baby ugly, right? You think that's what's going on here?
Well, I haven't kept up with this, but in a sidebar to preface my remarks, for many years I used to hear that, they used to have this, blindfolded throwing darts at the keyboard and predicting the stocks that are going to win, right? So I think it reminded me of that story. I'm going to explain here in a minute. First of all, like it says in your report, overconfidence breeds complacency, right? So this may well be the case in many cases. And this is to me a clarion call, because risk posture monitoring shouldn't be static, it should be dynamic and cyclical, right? Because people, process, and technology safeguards should be adapted as the risk appetite of security posture changes due to macro factors, business conditions such as M&A or joint ventures and things of that nature. Now, back to why did I preface it like that, blindfolded? It's because I think it's very important for CISOs, especially large organizations, to be more quantitative focus than qualitative focus, right? So instead of just blinking and saying, okay, this is red, yellow, green, but to some extent, if they have a scorecard that quantifies certain key factors tied to the business plan, it's much more easier to make that statement. But if you just sort of, eyeball it, which I think a lot of people are doing, I think that's the reason why I see that. And I think CISOs don't have time, but I think that's where private public partnership or cross industry groups across industries are very, very important, because we share best practice and help each other out. So I think that's pretty much what it is that people don't have a lot of I guess hybrid approach of qualitative and quantitative. Heather, what do you think?
I fully agree. I was going to highlight the qualitative approach of feeling confident. It's a feeling. And so we're asking an organization and its leadership how it feels. And if it's had a good year, it might feel pretty good. But like if when you buy a brand new car, you drive it off a lot, you're already incurring damage, wear, and tear to the car. So its value goes down. So if we rest on our laurels, hey, we did really well last year, we're feeling secure, then there's not enough quantitative there to back it up of, well, what changes tomorrow when we learn about a new breach, or we learn about if we don't know all of our technologies 100%, maybe somebody has some shadow IT. And it's so evolving. I think that's what I want to add. I think you had a really good insight there, Arun, on all the big things we need to focus on, but quantitative over qualitative in terms of determining confidence is a big one.
Do the two of you think we have an issue related to that where it needs to be quantitative when it comes to classifying our data? Do we know what kind of data we have and where it resides? And moreover, even if you do, then you still need to have the mechanisms in place to, because I have this pile of highly confidential IP data sitting here. I only want certain people to have access to it. But unless you have the controls in place, you can't really manage that actual risk. What are your thoughts on that front?
I think knowing the data, knowing what you're protecting is more important than protecting it, because if you don't have consensus on what you're protecting, it's very interesting in some of the conversations I have where we use a word in a group of people and they interpret that word differently. So unless we're really clear on what we're protecting, and it will change from time to time, it's very hard to protect it. So Arun can add the deep insights to that.
No, it's just not that I zoned out. Repeat the question again, Patrick, so I modulate.
We're talking about data classification versus actual protection controls being in place. That the handoff doesn't always happen between the two as it relates to the being the quantitative in our cybersecurity strategy.
Yeah, so I think so. We're talking about data at a holistic level, right? Not just the metrics around success, right? Because I think the answer is different for each case. I think in the second case, the one we started with, I think it's very important to have balanced scorecard with its 5 or 7 key factors aligned to the business, and then with Information Security and Privacy Council, for example, identifying key success factors and measurables, and kind of keep it and iterate it. However, on the other side, when you look at data as a whole, I think classification is not enough, because, as you know, classification can't be done automatically because the scale and pace of data growth, right? So the first thing you need is a data classification policy. But as we all know, once you have that policy, you can't manually, shine the light and microscopically manage it. You need a platform, right? I think we've talked about this subject before. So I think that's where AI can be a great help, because it can actually go in and it can identify something and say, well, look, this thing has got a social security number looking, so it probably is. So fix it. The permissions are off, right? But beyond that, I think we got to the point where, and we'll talk about that again. See, back in the day, we talked about visibility, right? So visibility of data, so platforms can do it. But now I think with AI, we have the advantage of actually using not just, I would say, passive visibility, right, and alerting, but you can use
Proactive.
observability and proactive, even fixing of the data problems. Like, obviously there could be some level of supervision, etc. Or if it fixes, if the platform finds an egregious store of data that's not well protected, they can temporarily just shut down access to it and send an alert to the CISO versus leaving the risk kind of a thing, right? So I think with AI, I see with transmuting, it's become more dynamic. The ability for security teams to be more efficient, not only in data protection but also in so many other areas like security operations, identity management, and what have you, right?
Yep, I agree with everything both of you just said. Heather, talking about industries, or let's transition over to that topic. The report listed some interesting findings on that front. Energy was at the very top of the list when it comes to risk. Life sciences, surprisingly, was relatively low. Technology was second in terms of highest. Did you have any takeaways for our audience in terms of the findings around industries? Any surprises, either high or low?
The energy is a bit surprising with regulations because you compare that with healthcare and all of the regulation there and the need to protect that data right down to, I'm going to draw on the export compliance piece. When you're exporting, you need to list the lot, its expiration date, and all that information about the lot at that level. And a pharmaceutical company might be exporting, giant amounts of pallets, and you still have all that data traceable down to that level. So going back through that, I think technology is not that surprising because of the overconfidence factor. If we go back to
I
that,
agree.
I think that's where we're pointing, and that's why it is as high as it is we work really hard, we're doing really good things, they're just not full coverage.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and if I may add a couple of things, that didn't surprise me at all because the reason is, if you look at the energy and the utility sector, there's a lot of Internet of Things devices there, the IoT
And old
devices, and
technologies that
space.
are 30 years old, right?
Yeah, all technologies, and they're not sort of meshed and networked. I mean, just take, for example, Ring camera or your TV. We've already seen our private life. So I think that's why the energy, they don't know, and they've seen some high profile hacks. So that's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
Pharma is so highly regulated, and like banks and whatnot, they've such a big budget because they've got to comply and check the box. Now, I know people say compliance is not security, but compliance can help security because you tend to get more money.
Yeah.
And the one in the tech sector doesn't surprise me at all. The reason being, even in this sort of somewhat, slowing down situation, there's so much turnover in the tech industry, whether in security teams, IT teams. And then you couple that with the need to adopt innovative technologies very fast. I think by nature that adds a lot of risk. I mean, if it's a little bit older company, they would be more measured in their approach. But tech companies are losing people so fast; they want to implement things so fast. That to me is a perfect storm, and I'm not at all surprised by these things. And it's a very valuable insights.
Interesting. That's good that we're on the mark with the data points is always positive from an expert standpoint.
I have
Arun,
one
go
more
ahead.
quick thing to add on that too. I think that hiring in the tech sector is broken, and I think that interplays with how secure and how we implement security. So that might be a topic for another day, but that to me also is just the hiring and how we manage people turning over. Go ahead.
Our next report. You
Mm-hmm.
just gave us another report to work on, I think. Arun,
Yeah.
one thing that I found interesting in the report, that I think the two of you probably did as well, is this concept of organizations that don't know their third party count. As we asked them, do you know how many third parties you have? Are 42% more likely not to know their breach frequency. This compounds into what we might call an exponential exposure risk, right? The exposure risk goes up because of the lack of visibility. And that was a key point that we had in the report was there's a lot of unknowns out there. And organizations should know? We're talking to senior leaders for the most part when we did this survey. So we're not talking about folks who are down in the trenches who wouldn't have visibility into some of the questions that we pose.
Yeah, a few things come to my mind. First of all, I think it's vital that organizations have a cross functional third party risk management process centered on policy and periodic state assessment, it's quarterly or semi annually or what have you, right? Now, to your point, I think at least two high level metrics are vital. Number one is risk tiers, because you've got to classify all your, at least your major suppliers or vendors by potential impact and likelihood of cybersecurity incident. That's a given. But you also need to be able to do security posture characterization, if you will. Be able to illustrate overall cybersecurity readiness and resilience across your supply ecosystem. And back to the point I was mentioning before, it's ideal if you can invest in a platform, because today many companies don't have the time or the budget in doing it through Excel spreadsheets. They're outdated as soon as you do them. So I think assuming that you have a policy-based framework, a cross-functional collaboration, and at least these two levels of tiers, I think having a platform-based approach where you have visibility across the supply chain is very helpful. Heather, thoughts?
Supply chain to me has always been physical, as you look at it from the export piece. And so translating that into software, of course, that makes sense. My company was typically a supplier, a third party, and all the evolution of how we used to say, here's how we're secure versus what we have to do now. It's been interesting to look through that. And I think that's going to be, even in the future, a bigger thing that third parties then are going to have to more deeply attest to their own security than they even do now, in a more standardized way than even, say, a SOC 2. So I see that coming. And then in addition, I think it is extremely important. And to go back, I mean, if we're just going to look at identify, detect, protect, then we're at the very beginning of identify. If we don't know who our partners are and we don't have that as deep in a data and measurable sort of way, then that's where we start, is making sure that we've identified them all, what they do, what they touch, what they can take.
Yeah, very, very true.
Well said.
So, all right, we got to talk about AI. Any podcast nowadays, that's on AI. And we did a standalone, actually the same data set back in June that we released as a report. So we'll stick that as a link at the bottom of the podcast that the audience can check out if you haven't seen it already. We've gotten great publicity around it and appeared in the Wall Street Journal and some other places. But Heather, let's start with you on the AI question. We found that while 64% track AI generated content, only 17% have technical governance frameworks in place to do so. That's in the June report. The 64% is in this new report that we're publishing. The risk score data at the same time shows organizations with no AI governance plans score 5.23 to be precise versus 4.12 for those fully implemented. This shows a substantial risk reduction if you have those things in place. Do you have any thoughts there? And we'll ask Arun for his as well.
Without governance, you can't manage. And so those who are working without governance are going to be experiencing shadow AI. They're not going to know what's leaving without something to protect them if they don't have that data loss prevention in place. And it is still a wild, wild west thing with AI and what we can do with it, and whether we're talking about just general LLMs and practices over whether people can access them at work or in-house AI and how that works. I think that governance is extraordinarily key, missing, and the United States is behind some other countries in how they're adopting what they are doing with AI. So I have a fairly laser-centric approach to that. Arun will probably add a bunch of wonderful things to that, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. I recently actually did a series of courses at Johns Hopkins on AI, and so I learned a lot in a quick time. I'm certainly not an expert by any means, but I thought, hey, let's learn about this cool stuff, right?
He's the typical PhD, Heather.
All right. But I think some things that come to my mind, and this is not to pick or say anything about any organization, but I've been talking to a lot of people, a lot of friends in the industry, and the things that I've understood through my various conversations are, and not all organizations are, facing these, but in no particular order. First is a lack of strategic vision, business alignment, and
Yeah.
leadership buy-in. Because at the end of the day, just like cybersecurity, privacy, where does AI fit into the business long-range vision objectives, right? The upper management needs to articulate that, and then call in functions like IT, legal, to see what does that do to the enterprise risk, right? Now, to me, I think AI should be one of the key enterprise. Having that right, you got to start with that. But I think many companies don't have an AI policy or reference use cases, and they're two separate things. The policy is the policy, but if you have an ever-evolving set of use cases for HR, legal, say you want to do this, you can use AI. You want to do that, you can't use AI, and keep that, and that can be a trusted
Mm-hmm.
guide to the people in the business functions, because today people are just flying blind. I think we talk in cybersecurity the skills shortage, but my God, if you talk about cybersecurity the skills shortage, what about AI? Demand for AI skills, I mean, I think really we can all agree far outweighs the supply today, right? That's for sure. And then the other thing is, okay, you want to use AI, right? Take the example of your data classification thing. We talked about AI there. How do you fit these things into the lens of integration, interoperability, and backwards compatibility with existing systems, right? Because you can't just plug it in, because AI wasn't designed for that. And what risk can you have? And just like with Power BI back in the day, you could take, data from one protected system, two and three, and make this view, and all hell will break loose. So people need to start thinking about all the issues. And fact of the matter is deployment cost, right? Because the thing is, if you, and I'm talking not just about technology per se, but it's the people, process, cost, it's time and effort. To me, deploying AI is kind of like in the old days of Six Sigma, right? People want to deploy Six Sigma. What they forgot is that in order to deploy Six Sigma on top of people's existing jobs, a lot of companies realized it was not that easy. I think the same's happening with AI.
Yeah.
People are just diving into it because it's a cool thing to do, but they're not doing the due diligence. I think
Yeah.
scaling and complexity have their place as well, because people don't realize that it's kind of like shadow IT, as Heather was saying earlier. Department A does one thing, and department, how cool is that? Can we use your model, make some tweaks to it, and they just rush to deployment, right? And the point, and it certainly gets so complex because just like shadow IT, shadow AI deployments are also expanding. So why do I mention that? Because to me, just like in mobile security when it first started, people would say, "Okay, this is very important. Let's just put it out there," and all these breaches would happen. They didn't do proper evaluation, they didn't do vulnerability assessment, they didn't do much of anything, right? Until the space matured. So I think what I'm trying to say is we need, it's just my word, AI development and deployment life cycle based and centered on the policy and business partnership with clear metrics and things of that nature. At least that's what I think. I mean, it's a lot, I know, but it's one of my favorite topics these days. So,
I think
Yes.
it mirrors the SDLC very closely as well, software development, system development lifecycle, that when we look at AI, that if we approach it appropriately, it doesn't change that much in terms of where we
Mhm.
understand things need to fit together and how we govern them and look through that. But it doesn't seem that way. I like to call that the technology hype trap. That, oh, I hear about this great new thing. I've got to implement that somewhere in my company. How do I do that? And then in the early days, it's not where it needs to be.
Yeah, that's a great point.
We're still in
For
the early
those in your
days.
audience, if you haven't checked out the new, if you haven't checked out the new IBM 2025 cost of data breach report, do so, because it does have a very, very substantial amount of information on AI. And we were talking before the podcast started about a couple findings that I found quite interesting.
Mm-hmm.
One, of every AI related breach that happens, 97% of them lacked controls. That's why, right? You didn't have the right governance policies and technical controls in place. You're more likely to be breached. The average data breach that was related to AI was $670,000 more than the average data breach cost. Data breach cost actually went down a little bit this year, which is the first time I think in the past 5, 6 years, or maybe it's been a decade since they went down since they started publishing that report. So there's some substantial risk involved if you aren't following the right strategy to begin with. To Arun's point, you don't have the right policies and controls in place. Second of all, so all right, we could have a whole
If
separate
I may,
conversation on
one
it. Go ahead,
thing,
Ray.
Patrick, one thing I just want to mention, we've been talking a lot of what companies can or cannot do or not able to do or hide, but the thing is sometimes you inherit problems too. For example, I don't know if either or both of you have heard of this thing called the Echo leak. It was a zero-click AI vulnerability that exploits Copilot's use of historical contextual data to silently execute hidden prompts without user interaction, right? And the unique thing about this attack method relied on embedded invisible prompt injection, right? And of course, why do I mention that? Because it demonstrates a broader class of risks tied to Gen AI features like summarization, and it brings to mind the importance of securing not just AI models but also the environments they act in. And I learned about this from Trend Micro because I subscribed to them and just trying to recollect it from my memory what they said. So I think it's important to, just as when you onboard SaaS programs or SaaS systems, I think as you
That's a
start to
great
take
point.
the system with AI using the same sort of due diligence, right?
Yeah, very, 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 very true. When you onboard an AI system, whether it's a private one or a public one, into your environment, you need to go through a checklist, just like you do a normal SaaS solution, to make sure that you have all the proper security controls in place. Well, I'm being cognizant of time. I want to make sure we cover a couple more topics here before we wrap things up. We could have a 2-hour conversation, I think, from the report, because there were a lot of interesting things in there. That's what happens when you use AI to do all this cross analysis. Now you can ferret out a lot more things than you do with just the humans doing it. The scoring rubric that we had, heavily weights detection time, and we saw that this is for Heather. 31% of organizations with back to the third party issue, 5,000 plus third parties in their environment take over 90 days to detect breaches. Man, there's a lot of things that go on in 90 days, unfortunately.
Yes, if we're back at identify and we're at detect. Detect should not be that difficult if identify is done well and the right tooling's in place. However, the reality is, I like to think about maybe there's one corporate refrigerator for an analogy, and there's a hidden drawer in there, and somebody put something in there, and we can detect that in a matter of days by smell. Not necessarily the case always if the right infrastructure and tooling isn't in place with security. The 90-day dwell time to an outsider seems like a very long time. I've seen other reports in some organizations that are less mature that it's a year. Or something like that. So I'm not surprised by it. I am disheartened because 90 days is a long time to do damaged exfiltrate data and do problems with it. So I'd like Arun to talk a little bit about it, and then I want to weigh in with something to see if he says something I'm thinking.
No, that's you're a hard act to follow, Heather, but I'm going to try my best. Okay. So, I think in addition to what Heather said, in my view, I think organizations should prioritize breach detection speed improvements by focusing on a combination of proactive measures, robust monitoring, and effective incident response plan. And there, I'm going to say it, at least semi-annual, if not quarterly, tabletop
Tabletops.
exercises driven by key and developing key playbooks for like supply chain or AI and keeping those up to date. Because preparedness is essential because anytime you hit a breach or incident, the paper plan is okay, but how do you know is it going to work very well? So including the business functions in it, making sure that, communications know what needs to go out in case of severe breach. All that needs to be, practice makes perfect. And I think many companies don't do that enough. And especially the age of AI and especially people are diving feet first, I think preparedness is key. In addition, you need to implement or deploy continuous monitoring, automate threat detection and response, and also regularly test the incident response plans beyond just the tabletop exercises, which is educational. So I'm talking about calibrating the plans on an ongoing basis, right? So
Mm-hmm.
focusing on these areas will help organizations identify and contain breaches faster and minimize potential damage. But that's not enough. We talked earlier about observability and having a paradigm shift from just passive insights to observability. So I think really leveraging platforms, whether it's a SIM or SOAR platform or EDR platform or data classification that has observability in it to take proactive corrective action with some level of supervision. I think that would be much needed. Thoughts, Heather?
The tabletops is what I was looking for. I tend to focus in security on the people and then lightly into the process with the technology is supporting. I think you and I complement each other because you've got the deep technical knowledge where you can bring in there and look at technology and process in addition to where it touches people and things like tabletop exercises and intentional planning and strategy. So thank you for adding all that because I couldn't have done that well. Appreciate that.
Teamwork makes the dream work, Heather. You're my new friend.
Indeed.
Least I can do.
All right, let's see. I'm looking at our questions here. We're going to skip one or two, but there's a couple of these I want to make sure that we cover. Privacy enhancing technologies, those without any privacy enhancing technologies, they scored high. No big surprise on the risk score index. While those who said they had a significant investment, which meant they had multiple technologies in place and processes and controls and so forth, they scored much lower. Arun, what's your sense here? We actually found that the adoption rate was pretty low here in terms of responses. I was surprised that it was this low. You have any thoughts on our findings?
I'm very shy, Patrick. I got to think. No, just kidding. In my long experience, almost a decade as chief privacy officer, I've actually fought these battles, so I can speak a little bit about them. So I think the reason is a variety of things. It's number one, it's complexity and usability, right? Because these PET systems, like you introduced, require a higher degree of technical expertise in the average user processes, right? Or because there's no training. Because many times you take these systems and you just put it out there and people use it. You can. So there's got to be a proper sort of onboarding of system plan in that kind. So that's the first thing. And in fact, I would say that many times, we need to bring the users into this complicated technology ahead of time, even during the pilots, getting their feedback, just buy it. And I think that's the reason why people hear, well, the system failed, but that's one of the main reasons in my view that it may fail. Next is cost, right? Because it's not just the cost of the platform or the time spent evaluating before buying, but it's the deployment and maintenance can be expensive and also requires major computing power, right? Especially for the many organizations that are challenged by limited resources, like many of the ones that took your survey and don't have it, I'm sure. Third thing I think is infrastructure and standards, because a lack of robust and widely adopted infrastructure and standardized solutions for privacy protection, hinders interoperability and overall adoption, right? And interoperability is key, especially, for example, in the healthcare space, because the risks of breaches are so high, and I think there's not always the proper framework. So that's a scary thing, right? And of course, I have to say auditability and governance challenges is something Heather can relate to, I'm sure. It's difficult to audit for regulatory compliance, accountability while assuring a balancing responsible use. That's a hard one, and I always struggle with that a little bit, making that clear to upper management. Then I think there's limited awareness and understanding, right? Because it's sort of a niche skill set. Privacy is very few organizations have dedicated privacy organizations. It's more like a loosely federated coalition. Where CISO knows a little, legal knows a little, HR may know legal, and they don't even do it at a programmatic level. Like there's a privacy program manager and all. So therefore, how do you then make users understand, right? I mean, I used to do boot camps and privacy training, but I had a limited budget. But we need to do all that. Then I think we talked about this in another area, complacency, right? Because I think people are so worried about oversharing data, and so then they sort of get lulled into a false sense of security, and therefore it undermines caution that hey, we need to be doing something more, right? And then the trust deficit, because we've seen so many as data breaches and whatnot, even with password managers or so many other things that many times, even me as an end user, I'm skeptical about a provider's ability to prioritize data privacy, which to me is a significant barrier. Heather, Patrick, did any of that resonate with you?
A lot. Yeah, privacy seems like it is just not the focal point in a lot of companies. Like you said, and sometimes this happens with exports as well. There's not an export compliance officer until there is. And so there's not a privacy officer until there is. And there's usually some sort of series of catalytic events that say, okay, now's the time, let's do this. And then that's a nice place for change in adopting how we approach dealing with privacy as something that's not a subset of security.
Do you see a move, an adoption by some of your clients to put in place a data privacy officer? Or are they still like tacking that on to multiple people within the organization? Or they're adding it to the CISO's responsibility? What do you see from a trend standpoint?
Arun, will you handle that one? Because my organizations I work with tend to be smaller and do not have the privacy officer.
One.
Right.
Yeah, well, I think definitely a few observations about that. I mean, I've come from the automotive industry, like, the mid-sized enterprise, right? And even there, sometimes it's not that easy unless you, for example, have some tailwinds. Like, for example, if you're working in Europe and you need to comply with GDPR, right? Or your operation in China or a Chinese company and you have to comply with data privacy law, or in the United States, HIPAA or California. Many companies won't do it. That's the one thing. But the sort of hidden thing that I've observed is many times I've heard people make these comments. Two of them. One is to say, well, this GDPR, for example, we're such a small company. They're not going to go after us. They're going to go after Google and they're going to go after, all those big companies. But that's kind of like playing Russian roulette, in my view, right? One shouldn't be doing that. So that's the first thing. It's like saying, okay, well, is it really worth it? So that's the one thing. So the other thing that I've run into very often in my career, and for example, it's happened to me at least a couple of times. Why do you talk so much about privacy, Arun? You've given us a cybersecurity training. You've talked to us about confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad. That's perfect, Arun. That's perfect. So why do you talk so much about privacy? And I said, well, that's great that you remember your training. That's wonderful, and thank you for that. However, I would say it in this way, cybersecurity is about data, and a lot of other things, but if it's a cornerstone, and privacy, it's about people. It's when the data is about people, that's when security and privacy becomes inextricably intertwined. And that's back to my earlier point about the lack of awareness and understanding. So those are the two things. But that being said, I think for sure, if you have those regulatory headwinds, it's at least good to appoint a DPO, because for GDPR, it needs to have it. Even Singapore data protection, you need to have it. And if you don't have enough resources, at least there's got to be a programmatic approach to be done. I think that should probably be led by the CISO. And I think one of the things, not to get on a soapbox, I think many times the CISO is under IT, and I think the CISO should be a peer of the CIO, should report to the chief risk officer, and one day maybe that umbrella of enterprise risk, security, privacy will be under the chief risk officer, and qualified CISO could be the chief risk officer. So I think that's needed, but we're not there yet, right? Because otherwise it's going to be, the example I'll give you is, some of us may have been to the disco, you go to a disco, you see all those beams of light and it's all really cool. But if you take all those beams of light and you coalesce them, you get a laser. And that's what I see in the field of privacy. It's like a discotheque, all these dancing beams of light. There's not enough coherence and focus, if that makes any sense.
Now I'm seeing black cats roller skating at the disco ball as a cybersecurity topic and privacy topic, because I'm got to write about that. That sounds very fun.
Yeah, I didn't think we'd be talking about discos on this podcast.
Yeah, I know.
So, all right, we got to wrap things up. But before we do so, I'd like both of your perspectives on takeaways or what organizations should do next. But Heather, let's start with you. Maybe we're at a critical inflection point this year. Almost half are at a point of high to critical risk. That means that your organizations are at risk. You're going to incur, in many instances, millions of dollars in detrimental value to your company, whether it's financial penalties, reputation loss, litigation costs. The list could go on and on, right? They need to do something. What do you recommend to these organizations? Where should they start? How would they prioritize the list of actions?
Well, first, don't panic. Panic should never be a priority. But that is sometimes after reading one of the reports, if you know that something in the report is a sore spot, then panic might be the first thing. So that's what not to do. What to do is not once. We have to be strategic, and it can't be just everybody sits down once and figures out what we're going to do. It has to be something in some cadence that says, this is a priority to us. Here's the reason why. Here is who it affects, the stakeholders, and here's who needs to be at the table. Because if we ask those things, those questions, and get those answers, then the team that approaches how to be better at security might be comprised of different people than we might have thought it would be years ago. You go back to what Arun said about now we're looking at security is not really a technical thing. It's how we enforce it. And now that technology is so integrated in our lives, it's under the CIO, or it's seen as a technical thing, and it needs to evolve as being one of the prime risk factors to any organization because we are so interconnected. So I would say take a look at how is our strategy going to be ongoing and who needs to be at the table, and it may be different than who we thought.
Interesting. Arun, any thoughts on your part?
Yeah, I think based on the report, the thing that I would say, the thing Heather touched upon earlier is enhancing visibility, because you can't protect what you don't see, right? Whether it's for third parties, AI, compliance, and what have you. But you don't just enhance visibility. We talked about earlier is boosting visibility with observability and orchestration to be proactive instead of reactive, and to initiate corrective workflows. So we talked over some of that earlier. But then how do you do that? I think I would submit like a few points. First is to enhance automation with intelligent insights, because observability will provide the data and insights necessary to build more intelligent and responsive orchestration workflows. Then accelerating and optimizing incident response. Orchestration can automate the execution of predefined responses to incidents detected to observability, enabling faster and more efficient incident resolution, right? So to your earlier question, how can you reduce the time for detecting breaches and all that? Then streamlined operations and reduced downtime. So combining real-time visibility and automated workflows for quicker issue identification remediation, which ultimately reduces downtime and improves overall system reliability. And now sort of the softer one, two of them: improve collaboration and communication, right? So the unified platform for observability and orchestration will foster better communication and collaboration between the different teams, both on the IT side and the business side. So in case of things need to be done, people will be actually able to actually enact some of the tabletop exercise lessons or the annual things that they did, right? And they can work together more effectively. And last is, back to my laser analogy, a laser focus on continuous improvement and optimization, because the insights gained from observability can be used to continuously refine and optimize orchestration workflows, leading to ongoing efficient and effective improvements in performance and reliability.
That's great. Heather, any final thoughts on what Arun said?
Combine everything I've said from the high level, get the people going, and put the process and the technology to it. And I think you have the answer there completely. That it is the people, the processes, the technology, and the people make the processes and the technology.
That's great. Well, I really appreciate all of your time today. You guys had some fabulous insights that our listeners will certainly find helpful. We want to encourage everyone to check out. It doesn't require registration. You click one click and you have the actual report. Make sure you click on that at the end of the podcast. And I welcome your insights and ideas in terms of how we can enhance and improve the report next year and in years to come. Before we conclude, Heather, how should folks get in touch with you if they're interested in knowing more about your consulting services?
You can reach me on LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest way to do. Just my name, Heather Noggle. And then I also have heathernoggle.com and then codastack.com, hnoggle@codastack.com.
And we'll include those links at the end of the podcast as
Great.
well. Arun, I assume kind of the same process for you as well.
Yeah, the same way. LinkedIn is the best way. It's always with me. So Yeah.
Well, we
Thanks.
encourage our listeners to reach out to both Heather and to Arun if you think you need their expertise as you tackle some of your cybersecurity and compliance projects. Well, that concludes another KiteCast episode. I think this is up to episode 48 or 47. I forgot. I've lost track. We're almost to hit 50. I know that. There's some great episodes, including the one that we talked to Arun about his background, and then he appeared in the other one there. We did a deep dive on the other report. So check those out. Look forward to having both of you on another KiteCast episode in the future. Thanks.
Thank you.